Welcome to No Apologies. Happy Thanksgiving. I'm Dana Lash. So for this Thanksgiving special, we're discussing the real story of Thanksgiving. We have to talk about socialism. You might not want to talk about it, but we have to, because socialism, actually really it's communism. Socialism's the stepping stool to communism, but it's all the rage. In fact, according to an Axios poll this last June, the highest number of Americans ever actually had favorable views about socialism. 41% of people, there's something wrong with them. They're infected with a virus called stupidity. And if we're to believe this data, it's growing fast. According to the polls, the youth of America are particularly enamored with socialism, although it should be pointed out it's not actually clear that they know what it is or can define it. And while Americans, at least those right there that approve of it, may not be able to define socialism, they know the basic idea is that the government is going to take care of me and make everyone and everything fair and equal. No. Perhaps this explains this sudden obsession with the word equity, the idea that everybody should be equal, and not really that everyone should have the same stuff, and it doesn't matter if discrimination is used to get you to have equitable whatever. Sounds great, but it's actually it's a lie. Here's the thing. We all yearn for fairness. Nobody likes seeing people with too little. And because we all have a tendency to be envious, we don't like seeing others with too much. So socialism, with its promises to make everything fair and equal, and communism have long appealed to people who apparently, like Bernie Sanders, are too damn lazy to work for themselves. In 2016, he ran on that without apology on socialism. And he actually would have been the nominee for the Democrat Party had Hillary Clinton not cheated in a number of primaries and caucuses. In fact, many people say that really, if it wasn't for the Clinton machine politics, yeah, he would have been the nominee. So you could have actually had a socialist candidate for president. Take it seriously, especially in light of the fact that Joe Biden, while he says he's a capitalist, governs exactly like a Marxist would. He's pushing the most aggressive expansion of federal government in modern history. So this Thanksgiving, because we haven't even gotten to tell you about it, I want to tell you a Thanksgiving story about how socialism was tried here in America and it failed. It really was the first, it was tried by the Pilgrims. So see, in 1620, the aristocracy and ruling classes of Europe were enamored with socialism. It was the fashionable new ideology, and so Pilgrims came with the intent to implement it. They thought it would be nice to do so, and it would make everything easier. Their charter, in fact, called for farmland to be worked communally and the harvest to be shared. And after a small band of Europeans, if they could make it across the Atlantic, they thought they'd need each other, like in this manner. So working together, sharing the resources equally, doing all the work equally, reaping the benefit equally, that's the way it should be. It was just this great idea, except just like communism, it doesn't work, and it didn't work for the Pilgrims because, as it turns out, those first few years of settlement were fraught with hardship and hunger. And in the diary of the colony's first governor, William Bradford, you read about settlers' initial arrangement: land held in common, crops brought to a common storehouse, distributed equally. So for every 2 years, every person had to work for everybody else, the community, not for themselves as individuals or families. It's like a pilgrimized version of Chaz or CHOP. Remember when they tried to do that in the summer of 2020? So the Pilgrims did not live happily ever after in their socialist utopia. And utopia is Latin for nothing, by the way. Nope, just like Chaz in Seattle, the experiment failed. The common property approach killed about half the settlers. And this was the problem. Governor Bradford recorded in his diary that everyone was happy to claim their equal share of production, but strangely, production shrank. Slackers showed up late for work in the fields. The hard workers resented it. And the problem was this thing we call human nature. Because see, as it turns out, human beings respond to incentives. Why do you work? Why do you punch the clock every day? It's like Dave Chappelle, like when he goes in interviews for, selling frozen yogurt, and they're like, tell us why you want to work for the frozen yogurt place. And he's like, well, it's my whole life has been about, 'cause I'm broke. That's why. One big incentive is that you want and you need to make money. That incentivizes you, actually, incentives do, to show up and to care and to try hard because you want to make more money. There's nothing wrong with ambition. And soon you discover that the harder you work, the more money you make usually. And that incentivizes you further. And the paycheck is the yield from your work. And you get to keep it and you can do whatever you want with it. After that, socialist Uncle Sam steals his cut, of course, forcibly. But back to the Pilgrims, right? Because, they wanted to make Bernie Sanders' socialist Latin word for nothing utopia a reality. They wanted to live off the land and break bread with the natives and braid hemp and all this other stuff, I'm sure. Polish each other's buckles on their Birkenstocks. Who knows? Their little Pilgrim Birkenstocks, probably the same thing. If they had Volvos, they'd drive them. It would be like returning to the Garden of Eden, right? If they had this perfect little world. Except the disincentives of Pilgrim's socialist scheme bred impoverishment and conflict, and then they were starving and dying. because socialism kills. This is real. So it's like today's idealistic self-described socialists. They want to reap the rewards of your labor. No one had any problem with everyone sharing the rewards from work, but what people had a problem with was sharing the work. It didn't take long to realize that, shrugging off work and slacking off that those people were getting the same reward as those who were working hard. So people faked illness, they didn't get their full effort, they complained of wasting their efforts on other people's families. You get the idea. Socialism turned Christian pilgrims into slavish grifters. But worst of all, half of them died and they starved to death. Governor William Bradford had this to say in his diary, quote, "By the spring, our food stores were used up. People were weak and thin. Some swelled with hunger. So they began to think about how they might not still thus languish in misery," end quote. So in desperation, what did Bradford and the Pilgrims do? They altered the system. They divided up their common property into private plots, and the new owners could produce what they wanted and keep or trade it freely. And the communal socialist failure was transformed into private property / capitalist success. And this has happened repeatedly throughout history ever. Only under Christianity and faith has more people been lifted out of poverty except with capitalism. Capitalism is amazing. The people over profits mentality produced fewer people until profit earned as a result of one's care for their own property and desire for improvement saved people. Bradford wrote of this change to private ownership. He said that it made, quote, "all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been," end quote. Yay, corn! Soon the Pilgrims, rather than starve for lack of food, they had so much that they could share food with their native neighbors. And to this day, America is the breadbasket of the world, producing so much food that we have enough to help feed the entire planet. So again, why does capitalism work while socialism repeatedly fails? After all, the idea that we all keep what we earn and some have much more than others, that seems selfish. Well, it turns out that self-interest is what drives human beings, just like animals in nature, whether we like it or not. And I mentioned the Chaz, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle earlier. That was the communal zone set up in Seattle during the summer of unrest after George Floyd was killed. And in the Chaz, like modern day Pilgrims, the Chaz Chop Zone, people would need no police, just like free love and free weed and free food. They'd start a farm like the Pilgrims, except they could not farm to save their ever-loving lives. They called it the People's Garden. Everyone contributed their labor. Nobody knew what the hell they were doing. And they said, soon we'll reap the bounty. And they'll have free health care and yummy organic vegetables to be shared by all. And it would be all so easy. They would have their very own Whole Foods, grown free, and Jeff Bezos wouldn't get $1 because there's no money either. You just take what you need. Yeah, well, we all know how that ended. It was disaster. They didn't grow a single damn thing. In fact, some of the stuff that they got wasn't even heirloom stuff. They didn't even have seeds. So you would think if they were smart, they would have gotten stuff that had seeds so they could just plant year after year, morons. And then there was theft and rapes and murder in the Chaz Chop. And you had a SoundCloud warlord that was distributing guns from his electric vehicle. I'm not making this up. His name's Raz Simone. He demanded people pay him a tax if they wanted to live in Chaz and be protected. I'm not making this up. This is the craziest. It's like a movie. And those crops from the communal Chaz farm, it was a disaster. Probably the Pilgrims at least knew what the hell they were doing when they planted corn. Chaz was a real-time experiment in communal living that failed in just an amazing fashion. It was something to behold. It was a modern-day repeat. Actually, Pilgrims were smarter. It really was. So did our ruling class and the legacy media or the academics in the Marxist Democrat Party learn anything from Chaz Chop? No. As leftists always do when socialism fails, they ignore it. The problem for the left is never socialism. Their excuse is that it just wasn't done correctly. That's what they always say. But the problem with that is that with that takeaway is that socialism has never been done right because it can't be, because it violates human nature. We're all self-interested and we all look out for our own best interests. And if you say otherwise, you're a liar. I wish this wasn't true, but it is. Capitalism is a system that embraces human truth and exploits it to everyone's advantage. In a capitalistic system, every good and service that's exchanged is mutually beneficial to both parties. And the farmer works his own land for money that he keeps. It enriches him, incentivizes the farmer to work harder. And you work hard for money so you can do things like eat. And you don't need to worry about tending some communal garden that everyone owns and no one owns because the farmer's already doing it for you because it's his business and it benefits him to take care of the farm, and that benefits you because for a little money you can walk into a grocery store and you can pick out whatever vegetable and meat you want. It's all clean and delicious, not grown by hippies and Chaz Chop. And it's more than anyone could ever want. And it's all ready to be prepared for your Thanksgiving table, to be shared with your extended family, and plenty of leftovers. Ironically, you never lifted a finger in that farmer's field. There's a famous speech in a movie called Wall Street, and I'm sure the writer meant it as a condemnation of the ruthlessness of capitalism in America, but inadvertently, it made a very convincing case for the free market. Gordon Gekko, as you know, is the character. He had a shocking message for his shareholders and company where he says greed's good. Watch.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA.
Gordon Gekko called it greed, and while it sounded harsh, his character in Wall Street's making a point. See, we can think of greed as a vice, but replace it with self-interest. And whether you like it or not, everybody is self-interested. It's a fact of human nature. You have to work against human nature. I mean, goodness works against human nature, really. Capitalism, unlike socialism, embraces this reality, but it exploits it for the good. That's the thing. Capitalism, because it acknowledges human nature, transforms greed and self-interest from a vice to being a virtue. And when Pilgrims embraced the reality that they too, even as Puritans, were motivated by self-interest, they moved to embrace privatization and ownership. And that's when their harvest and their production exploded. The lesson was not lost on them, and the idea of private ownership based on the principle of self-interest, that became a part of American DNA. And it works so well that America has become the most powerful economic engine in the history of the world. A country with so much excess wealth, it actually provides military security not for itself but the planet. Socialism, on the other hand, fails and murders people. Communism's killed millions of people. Socialist governments, communist governments can't feed or take care of their own. Whether in Stalin's Soviet Union, which starved 30 million of its own people, Venezuela's currently collapsing government, and Cuba's 60 years of slow deterioration. Or what about China's Great Leap Forward, where in a world where there wasn't famine, you have the worst case of human-made famine ever. It's the Pilgrim principle or the Chaz axiom. All this stuff never works. Communal living denies human nature, and the only thing it consistently produces is misery. It was socialism that gave the world the Berlin Wall that separated Western Europe and Eastern Europe. That wall was the Iron Curtain. On the eastern side, there was abject poverty. On the other, Western Europe, it was explosive in wealth and freedom, really. The contrast between the two systems was stark. And you'll see that same contrast to this day all over the world. Abject poverty in places like Venezuela, Cuba. Extraordinary wealth just a couple of 100 miles away in Florida. Starvation in communist North Korea. Excess of food and wealth in South Korea. Even communist China only pulled itself out of poverty when it embraced, and yes, you could say through the administration of Tokyo, free market capitalism for communist do-gooders. So why do Americans and people across the world continue to pursue this strain that always ends in failure? It's human nature. They think that we can return to this utopian garden where everything's free and everything's perfect and it's all equal. It's all a beautiful dream. Problem is, it's corrupted human nature. Capitalism isn't perfect because humans aren't perfect. But you will find no better system, and you will find no system that's done more to lift people out of poverty across the world over. It's not perfect, but it's way better than the alternative. I'll take that. Coming up, we continue this conversation with Wilfred McClay. He's a professor of history at Hillsdale College, and he's written a lot about William Bradford and those early settlers. Keep it here. Black Rifle Coffee develops their explosive roast profiles with the same mission focus they learned as military members, and being founded and operated by veterans, Black Rifle Coffee knows what a quality cup of coffee means to active duty troops who are away from home for the holidays. And as a result, they're committed to supporting all who serve. With every purchase you make, Black Rifle Coffee gives back. In 2020, they donated over 6 million cups of coffee to soldiers overseas, law enforcement officers, firefighters on the West Coast, and medical workers during the pandemic response. And so for the month of November, every coffee purchase you make, a bag of their limited edition holiday roast will be sent to service members overseas for Christmas morning delivery. So support the cause. Visit blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV. Check out the freshest coffee in America. blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV for 20% off coffee, apparel, gear, and your first month of the coffee club. So we just discussed the real story of Thanksgiving, and just to continue that conversation, we go to our next guest. Joining me now is Wilfred McClay, professor of history at Hillsdale College and visiting scholar for the Heritage Foundation. Wilfred, thank you so much for joining me, and happy Thanksgiving to you. It's good to have you with us.
Happy Thanksgiving to you too, and it's a pleasure to be with.
Of course. I wanted to talk to you about, those the going back to Pilgrims and the earliest settlements of the United of before it was even the United States, because there's that one story that we all hear of. The first settlement, it was everyone pretty much had land, and it was held in common ownership. Common ownership of land, common, fruits of the harvest, all of this other stuff of their labor. Everybody got the same. But in the very beginning, I think this was Plymouth. I know that there's been a lot of discussion, and this is where you come in historically, as to where this actually happened and how successful it was. But we know that at some point, the early American settlers deviated from that kind of structure to individuals being able to own their own property and bringing up what they could from their own harvest. And they were way more prosperous going down this path. What can you tell us about, this early American history?
Yeah, well, we know about this from William Bradford, who was gives us the main account of Plymouth colony, and it simply was that the first winter was so brutal, so awful, just terrible. The first winter after the landing in 1620. One of the things that Bradford and his leaders, his elders, talked about and decided on is that it would be more. They would be more. That the harvest would be fuller and more adequate if they divided up the land and let each person be responsible for his own land rather than do all the work in common. And it's interesting. Bradford was a little bit ashamed of this. He saw it as a concession to the fallenness of human nature. He had to do this. We were a long way away from Adam Smith, who's really 150 years later. The idea that general good could come out of individual self-interest. The Puritans were still very much in a kind of older communitarian way of looking at this, and that's the way they talked about the settlement. It's going to be a communitarian thing, but they had to, and this is often what American experience has been. People come with certain ideas, and they have to adjust to the realities that they face, and this is part of what happened at Plymouth. And it did prove to those of us in looking in retrospect, it sort of proves the value of the concept of private property and of individual responsibility for one's own land. But they didn't get it right off the bat. They didn't say, "Oh, capitalism! What a great idea!" It took a while. But I think it's fair to go back and look at Bradford's account and say, "Yeah, this is maybe it is a concession to human nature, but a lot of good things come out of working with the grain of human nature instead of against it. Socialism and its ilk are against the grain of human.
You've spoken about this. I was going to say you've spoken about this quite a bit, because dovetailing into this, you gave a talk, and I watched some of this online. This was 2020 last year, and I think the title it was based on a book that you have out that looks at American history. I think it was The Last Hope. And it was a very interesting talk, because you got into those fundamental principles that really we incorporated into the creation of the United States, and a lot of that's under attack right now with the CRT, the Marxist theory. And you spoke at length about those, because that's really what made this great experiment so great and so long lasting, and really turned the United States into the country that it's in, that shining beacon on the hill. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, these people, we call them pilgrims, and they were pilgrims. They came to North America for religious reasons. There were some who came aboard the ship who had economic, motives, but the bulk of it, the essence of it, the core of it, was religious. So they were pilgrims. At the same time, they did something really remarkable with the Mayflower Compact, and that was when they were about to land, they realized that they were landing in an area outside the range of the royal charter that they'd been granted. And so that meant it was outside the range of law. And the people aboard ship who were not religiously committed were sort of saying, well, as soon as we get there, we're going to take off and do our own thing. And they realized that they couldn't allow that to happen. They needed those people. They called them the strangers. They needed the strangers to make the economy work. So they came up with this idea, Mayflower Compact, really like a social contract. Even before John Locke had the idea of a social contract, they came together and formed a civil society, and it melds a religious and a secular purpose. And that's been one of the things that, at least in our early years, and I think it's still true, that the United States has melded religious and the secular in a fruitful way that hasn't been possible in a lot of other countries in the world. And so we don't know for sure whether the first Thanksgiving was celebrated as a religious feast. We just have such scanty documentation about it. But the fact that these people were pilgrims is indisputable, that they were religiously motivated. So I think it's a great thing to reach back to. One other thing that historians insist on, and I think it's important to mention, that they didn't think they were founding the United States. They didn't have any idea they were doing it. They were simply trying to found a colony where a true religion could be practiced. That was their goal. I think, and part of the story that's true does involve, that we know is true, does involve Indians, the local Indian tribe, participating and donating venison during this hard winter. Sadly, relations with Indians deteriorated later, but at the outset, they were good, and that part of the story is not a myth. There's a lot of mythology that has attached itself to Thanksgiving. I don't think that should be allowed to become the main focus of what I think is a great holiday, maybe the greatest American national holiday, because what could be more fundamental, more warranted than for us to give thanks for all the things that we have. And so it's a time that,
that's a great point.
As a country, as a people, we stop what we're doing. We get together with our families. We kind of get back to roots. And it's funny for me to say as a historian, but I'm less concerned that we can prove chapter and verse of what we understand Thanksgiving to being traceable back to these origins. I think what we have is a magnificent tradition, and I don't want to see that tradition pulled down, sullied. It's so important to the good of our national life. So, and I think we have enough basis in history to go.
I agree with that. Well, I certainly enjoy your work, and I very much enjoy your talks. I've seen a lot of those online. It was so incredibly informative because you really dive into just the backstory of those principles, and you really explain it in I think a very vibrant way. So thank you so much, Wilfred McClay. Thank you. We appreciate your time with us.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
So coming up, how are they teaching your kids about Thanksgiving? Corey DeAngelis joins us next to discuss. Keep it here. You have homeowners insurance for a good reason, because without it, a fire, flood, or burglary could destroy you financially. But there's another major crime that your homeowner's policy doesn't cover, and it's called home title fraud. Law enforcement calls title fraud one of the fastest growing crimes, and it can ruin you financially. This is why you need Home Title Lock. Title fraud happens when a criminal forges your signature on documents stating that you sold your home to them and takes out loans on your home and leaving you with the payments. You spend a fortune in legal fees trying to prove that you didn't commit fraud. Home Title Lock puts a barrier around your home's title title, and the instant they detect anyone, cyber thief, renter, or relative trying to forge their way into your home's title, they help shut it down. Visit HometitleLock.com, register your address to see if you could potentially be a victim, and enter code RADIO for 30 free days of protection. That's code RADIO at HometitleLock.com. Welcome back to The First. Have you spoken to anybody about Thanksgiving and the first thing they bring up is how the Pilgrims were mean to the Indians? And it's usually like the result of critical race theory indoctrination in America's public school system. You know, I remember when I was in school and it was Thanksgiving, you know what we all did? We did turkeys with our hands, and then for all the fingers, we would write about things that we are grateful for on each one of the fingers. That's what we would do. And we talked about how we are blessed to live in this nation. Now, kids are told the nation's horrible. It's basically the home of the devil. It's awful. Everything's bad, and the whole country needs to be deconstructed. So it seems like that's kind of what kids are being taught anymore. You don't have anything to be thankful for Thanksgiving. It's a corrupt country that needs to be torn apart and rebuilt in the CRT image. We bring in Corey DeAngelis. He is the National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children. He is one of the key leaders in the fight against CRT. Corey, thank you for being here, and a happy early Thanksgiving. What are kids being taught in school about Thanksgiving anymore? Because it doesn't seem like it's a celebration of things to be thankful for in this amazing nation that we all live in. So what are they learning?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the local school district, obviously, but we've seen stuff circulating in the news where children are learning not to really be thankful for their country and the history of our country. So that's obviously a huge problem, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's been this kind of pushback at school board meetings, and families, you know, they got to see what was going on in the classroom through the disastrous remote learning over the past year and a half. And that's why we've seen a renewed call for just accountability at the school board level, but then also school choice initiatives, having the funding following the child to an institution that best aligns with their family's values. What's also interesting to me with the holiday season is that there are some school districts that are taking off Fridays for the rest of the year because of, they need to take off mental health days, or in Detroit public schools, for example, they're canceling the rest of the Fridays because of a concern about COVID spread, which raises the question, is this because COVID only attacks and spreads on Fridays, or is it because the employees want a longer weekend through the rest of the holiday break?
That's fascinating that they would have to take that Friday off. And Corey, I was reading this piece, and now, of course, it's been such a crazy day that the school district specifically slips my mind. But it was a school that discovered, after they started bringing kids back in for in-classroom instruction, they decided, oops, we actually don't have the social capability of all being in the classroom again, because we were all doing the remote learning for so long that people forgot essentially how to be in a classroom together in existence again, which kind of goes to show you how bad the lockdowns were. We're showing these images by Corey of kids dressed up as like turkeys and I guess Indians and pilgrims. Can kids even do that anymore, or is that they accused of appropriation?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the school district again, but probably for the most part, you won't see that as much in the traditional school system because of these claims of appropriation. Yeah. And look, I mean, I think we should respect everybody's choice when it comes to how they want their children to be educated. Maybe you want, more celebratory things in the classroom, and we should be able to choose schools that are aligned in that way. But maybe you don't want to touch any of the things that may be perceived as political when it comes to the history of our country. And maybe you should be able to choose a school that's aligned with your values in that way. I think the best way forward, and to be frank, the only way forward to embrace freedom rather than force, is to let every single family choose for their own kids instead of trying to control how other people's children are educated and raised. So this is a problem with the one-size-fits-all school system, and there isn't a perfect solution, but the best solution is to allow people to choose.
Yeah, allow people to choose. And parental sovereignty obviously is under attack, whether it's the DOJ and FBI tracking parents as domestic terrorists, which is insane that we're using the Patriot Act, which people were warned about that, but they didn't listen apparently, to track parents simply for objecting to CRT in their school districts to, in my town, in our district, now you have the Department of Education that's bringing in the Civil Rights Division because they say that failure to implement, they're saying that CRT, if you don't implement CRT, that's basically a Title IX violation. And how dare you? So they're going to bring in the Department of Education to do an in run around parents who defeated this stuff at the ballot box. So it seems like, Corey, parents can't go anywhere. Parents can't have any kind of effect over their children or sovereignty over their children without some alphabet government agency weighing in and saying, nope, you can't do that. You have to do it our way. Your thoughts?
I mean, this is abusive government overreach, and it has been a massive attempt to silence and bully parents into submission. But I'm actually optimistic because all this is doing is backfiring on these federal government bureaucrats who want to silence parents. Because look, parents are waking up more than they ever have before, and they're not being bullied. They're not going to just sit down and shut up, no matter how many members of the establishment try to label them as domestic terrorists. Parents are just going to continue to fight back harder than ever. And we're seeing this play out all across the country. Parents are really mobilized right now. And I'm optimistic because parents will fight for the right to educate their children as they see fit, harder than anybody will fight to take that right away from them. And in fact, 13 state-level school board associations have already pulled their funding or membership or participation from the National School Board Association over their letter and collusion with the Biden administration and the White House. So look, it turns out that parents don't like to be labeled as domestic terrorists for wanting to have more of a say in their children's education. And it's sparking this new parent-led revolution when it comes to parental rights and K-12 education. And they're not going to go away anytime soon. They're essentially this new special interest group in town that politicians would be wise to listen to, because parents care about their kids more than anybody else.
There you go. That's true. And more than anyone else, and that includes the government. Corey DeAngelis, American Federation for Children, thank you so much for joining us, and something to be thankful for this Thanksgiving, those victories. Thanks so much. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, folks, coming up, experts trying to ruin Thanksgiving with the push for boosters and guides on how to deal with unvaxxed family members. We'll break it down next. Keep it here. The first TV was named after the First Amendment of the Constitution and the right to speak out about what we believe and hold dear in our passions and pursuits. It's the most fundamental thing about being an American. And when we chose the name for this network, had no idea how important and timely a decision that would be. Freedom of speech is more important and more vital than it has ever been before. So we need you to join us. Activate and become a part of that fight. Visit thefirsttv.com/support or the First TV app and learn how you can join the fight by supporting the First. Thanks to Biden's economic policies, job numbers have been abysmal and inflation is skyrocketing. And instead of following the former president's pro-business agenda that had the economy booming, Biden wants to tax corporations and pass trillion-dollar bills that we can't pay for. It's time for you to take proactive steps to protect your wealth and retirement by investing in gold and precious metals. Legacy Precious Metals can help. Washington keeps printing money to pay for their outrageous bills, but all that does is devalue your dollar. Gold offers a hedge against inflation, and as the dollar gets weaker, gold gets stronger. The folks at Legacy Precious Metals are the gold standard when it comes to investing in precious metals, and they have a team of experts who can counsel you on the best options for you and your family. Don't leave your retirement to chance. Call Legacy Precious Metals at 866-580-2088 or visit them online and download their free investor's guide full of useful info at legacypminvestments.com. Thanksgiving can be a very, very stressful time for tyrannists and Marxists. One, finding something to be grateful about when you're a Marxist is so hard. It's such a challenge. Everything would be so much better if you were in charge and ruining the country. And America sucks, so there's no being thankful for your country. And being a progressive leftist, even if you're thankful for just like something, it's the usual stuff. Like you're thankful for being smarter and more moral than everyone else, and you thank yourself for that since you don't believe that there's a God to give thanks to. Well, now, to add to all of this Thanksgiving stress, Marxists are already getting antsy about Thanksgiving for another reason. they have to be around their backwards relatives. It's like a thing every year, isn't it? So in the last few years, article after article offers counsel to these snowflake Marxists about how to deal with relatives who might vote differently than them, or like have habits wherein they support the police or they fly the American flag on their porch. Now, on top of it all, anti-MAGA and Uncle Anti-Vaxxer Vinny are endangering your very life by not being injected with a government solution, and they don't wear face panties either, or masks. Well, you can stop hyperventilating, Democrats. CNN's all over it. In a new article, they offer an array of ideas for how to handle Thanksgiving with your unvaxxed and unwashed kinfolk. First, the CNN piece wants you to know that if you must spend Thanksgiving with possible domestic terrorists that happen to be your relatives, you're safest outdoors. That's right. Never mind that your great-grandma is likely going to die after being exposed to below freezing temperatures. It's a risk she'll have to take to keep you healthy. Have your aunt just pass you some turkey through the window. After all, the vaccine is like a raincoat, the CNN article says. It'll protect you during a rainstorm. But if you're in a thunderstorm, you'll still get wet. Meaning standing inside next to the candied yams, really, they're sweet potatoes. We'll fight. And your unmasked great-grandma that watches Fox News could get some of her icky virus on you. Maybe it's better just not see your great-grandma in person ever again. Like, you can always see her at her funeral when she's no longer a threat to you, like at a safe distance. Maybe you could even request that a mask be placed on her when she's in the casket. CNN didn't say that, but no, Brett did. But the point is that you can't be too careful. The CNN article also says that you have to take the threat from your leprous extended family in stride. So if you've had your vaccination, your booster, and you've prayed to your Dr. Fauci statue that morning, you should be fine. Now, most people don't end up in the hospital with the Rona. That's right. CNN only, in fact, 1 to 5% of all cases do, and they always have secondary conditions. But good to see the CNN article being sensible. Finally, the CNN piece reminds progressives that boundaries are loving. So you can always just skip Thanksgiving with grandma altogether this year. The article advises that you could say something like this to let grandma down easy, quote, "We love spending time with you, and I also recognize that you want connections so much, and it's not so important for you to wear a mask or follow procedures, but for us it is. Love you, want to see you, how about coming over to our house another time," end quote. That's right, progressives, you can see grandma another time, like on a Zoom call when you're using the toilet. Or maybe she could swing by for Thanksgiving in 2031 when Darth Fauci gets his plague under control and you've had your 43rd Pfizer booster. No need to risk your life now. You're too grateful for being the one and only you to let your selfish granny, who's loved you unconditionally and put up with all of your annoying things, to get anywhere near you unless she's triple vaxxed, quadruply boosted, and double masked. And if grandma dies from asphyxiation or freezing outside or just plain loneliness, she'll have given her life for a good cause, preserving yours. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.